covered a lot of territory, so I'm going to focus about on how Gulf got started, but also what's the impetus behind its thinking, because in a way, it comes out of our experience with organizing within the Occupy movement as artists, Occupy Wall Street, as well as strike debt, and using specific tactics and strategies, but that aren't just about direct action, but is in fact working on the ground and movement-generated theory and acting upon that as artists, as cultural workers. The experience in Occupy was that a lot of us were cultural workers. We were precarious workers that had time to do stuff and had creativity to communicate messages and be effective of all the different ways that we can actually strike blows at the system, open up space for other people, engage, and facilitate a self-organizing space. So one of the key factors that we brought into the campaign was organizing. So, and this is different from what people would understand the Yes Men as doing, because they would do tactical teams of 2 or 3 people, they would intervene, this would create some kind of media coverage or some kind of space. What we were talking about is, how can we involve 10s, 20s, 30s, 40, 100 people, 200 people, and choose strategic targets that effectively we could not just do symbolic actions, but actions that would that would cause material damage. And thinking about Gulf in that light is very instructive. The second thing is that in our debt analysis, before we learned a lesson from organizing around debt, which is not everyone has the same understanding of what debt means, right? Debt in a narrow sense means financial debt. But in a broader sense, it is bonds that hold us together, and they could be negative and they could be positive, and we all owe debts to each other, whether they're familial or societal, whether they're generational, and whether they're based on race, right? So there's a debt owed for the Native Americans in the United States. There's a debt owed to African Americans who were slaves in the United States. Those are also debts. And thinking about how can debt be a basis of solidarity, and what does that look like? And in a way, what we're most familiar with is the debts that we owe to banks. Those debts that are individualizing, those debts that add to our alienation, those debts that are forms of social control, those debts that Hart and Negri talk about as the emergence of the indebted as one of the subjectivities. However, when we tried to organize within Occupy Wall Street, when we lost the park and tried to organize around debt, we realized that people's understanding around debt is very neoliberal in itself, right? So education is a private debt. Housing, mortgage is a private debt. These debts, everyone wants to not pay them off, right? But they're also not willing to recognize the debts that they do owe, and those debts that could form a basis for people power. Within that understanding, we figured one of the ways in which we can work in Gulf, which is cross-class, so there is a challenge, and transnational. There's a transnational. So how can we think of debt in a transnational sense? And how can we think of debt in a cross-class sense? And how can we be mindful of race? Which, if you look at the people that were on this picture, right, they were brown. These are brown people, right, that are also employed by Arabs, but also have a colonial history, right? So what are the debts are we thinking about in that context? And what are the climate debts that would emerge? So definitely opening up that space and saying to the people that we're involving in this campaign, we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions that could lead to better questions. And this pamphlet that we distributed was present in our first meeting that we called for. That included students from NYU, so they're directly implicated in what's happening on the island in which the museum is being built. We involved artists who are actually, the Guggenheim would be part of their community, so there's something there. Art students who are actually being graduated with immense amounts of debt, right? And what kind of coalition can emerge out of that? Not a coalition in which we need to help the poor, brown worker who's building this like high-class thing for some luxury 1% people, right? But almost what kind of coalition can emerge of equals that is not about, it's about helping ourselves and helping them in the process help themselves. And that's not that we knew the answer coming together, but that was the start of the type of work that we're doing. So when we think about Gulf, we think more about what kind of coalition are we building, and obviously the most spectacular are the actions. Those are what get reported, those are whatever. But from our sense, this project is about finding ways to build power and trying to establish, to lend blows at these institutions that put us in a difficult position financially and in life, and also build our relationships with one another. How am I doing on time? Because I don't want to.
Still at 5 minutes. So.
Okay, so that's kind of the basis. So I want to just kind of reiterate the fact that when we think about debt, we think of it in an expansive sense. When we launched this campaign, it started with no debt is an island, as a way to bring people together in a room, that then continued into 4 meetings that resulted in kind of a consensus around an action, but that it was a strategic move. We said we're not going to limit the campaign to what's happening in Abu Dhabi. We know that the person in charge and where we could lend a material blow is in New York. So we took the battle to them in New York. And they tried to claim it wasn't fair, and we tried to say, of course it's fair. You're Guggenheim, you just sold your name, right, to Abu Dhabi as a franchise. You could control what happens, right? So that was something that we did. And then the second thing that we said is that we're going to come up with another name. Because this isn't about all of us being unified in the same tactics, or trying to agree that we're all in the same position, but trying to create new spaces of resistance, new spaces of imagination, and so that this effort can multiply and flourish, and we can learn from all the different ways, and not be afraid of failure, potentially, right? And I think that's something that in the context of Occupy, there are successes and failures. In the context of Strike Debt, there are successes, and we experience failures. But that's continuing on with this campaign of like, let's take on cross-class, let's be aware of race, and let's fight from where we're at, which is New York. And this is the other aspect of privilege. We understand in New York that there's an immense amount of privilege. The same actions that we do in New York, if we did them here, they may not get the same coverage. We know this. This is an added responsibility on us in New York, right? And so when we're here in Venice, this is the space that we need to be, right? And this is the type of coalition that we need to build. And we need to go back to New York, and we need to figure out how we can be more effective. Because the borders that exist are not the borders that can lend us power. They're the borders that stop us. This is in fact what Gulf is doing for me, right? I don't think of it in terms of art, although I would say I am an artist, and I don't consider them in terms of an activist, although I do activist work. And I think these identities are something that we should be comfortable with. Everyone wants to categorize us, but in the context of the work that we do, I frankly don't give a shit, right? And I'll leave it at that.
So what I'm going to do is I will just quickly go over some of the actions that we've done as Gulf. As Amin already mentioned, that the different spectrums of organizing that are important to us, and that on one end of the spectrum are artists, precarious artists, NYU students, intellectuals in New York, and the other spectrum is actually workers who are of course in debt bondage and don't get paid a living wage and go into recruitment fees, for recruitment fees, but they're also striking and resisting every day, right? So that is something that doesn't really come out that much in the media. So to understand that it's not just like you said, like go help the workers, but also amplifying voices, and also to understand that workers are already striking. And I think the research trips that we do are actually really important for building this coalition, because it's a kind of a cycle. So when we go back, we actually talk about the actions that we have done and if they've heard about them, or like, you know, how can we kind of start this loop of organizing within that. And in this loop, addition to this is also the sending side of the countries, which is some of the organizing that we're doing now, specifically in India. There's a bunch of, there's a group called Society for Labor and Development. They're trying to think of how to actually push the governments from the sending side of the countries to actually start some policies which hold recruiters accountable. Because that is something that has been a big critique within the campaign as well, is like, go ask the sending side of the countries. They're the ministers, they're the ones who are corrupt, versus the Gulf countries or Guggenheim in itself. So, so I would just divide up some of the things that we've done within the campaign, or the actions, as 4 different categories. One is organizing, which Amin's talked about. The other is tactics. The third being media, and the fourth being aesthetics. So within organizing, like we said, we try to organize a space which is also reflective of the analysis that we've been working on. So I wouldn't talk more about that. In terms of tactics, we've tried to occupy Guggenheim in different ways. And we've kind of done it in 2 different phases. Other way. This way, okay. I'm trying to look for the first action image. Okay. We've done it in 2 different phases. The first phase kind of began on 22nd February last year, 2014, and we're right now in the second phase. And you know, the May Day action that we did is kind of stepping off of that. So the first action was actually very simple. And this is also like, how we learn. From every action we learn, and then we try to escalate from there. If you know the space within the Guggenheim, it's actually a spiral, right? So the picture that was there before, and it kind of is reflective inside. So you have 8 different floors. The way voice travels between these different floors is kind of really crucial to us. And we think about all of these things as we're organizing. So the first action was just straight up going into the Guggenheim, throwing banners, and just reading a collective manifesto from 5 different levels, talking about what is the future of art. And in terms of aesthetics, it was important that we connected it to the exhibition that was going on at that time, which was actually Italian Futurism, right? So we were talking about, like, is this the future of art? And the manifesto was kind of like, who's building Guggenheim Abu Dhabi? Migrant workers in 50 degrees of heat, migrant workers resisting every day, migrant workers in debt bondage, and is this the future of art? So kind of, there was a manifesto with that. The second action that we did related to that was actually occupying its facade, which was just, kind of making, visualizing the 1% Global Museum, which is going to Helsinki, which is going to Abu Dhabi, and is, is kind of the chain that Marcos was talking about earlier. And is here in Venice as well, right? And it's, I think if you think about museums specifically, Guggenheim is the kind of pioneer in establishing its global outposts everywhere. I heard they want to do one in Mexico soon, so I don't know how that goes. But and then the third action was kind of taking our cue from Abby Hoffman, who went into the New York Stock Exchange and threw dollar bills, right, as a critique of New York Stock Exchange. And we designed a dollar bill similar to that and just threw 10,000 of those from the top of the Guggenheim. So this was like occupying the space visually in a different way. And this one, I think, another tactic that we've also thought about is actually them paying a material price. So these were actually stickers that we made and went and pasted them on the walls of the museum, too close to the artwork, right? And so from like internal resource sources, we also heard that they actually had to answer their investors about like what is the security of the museum if artists can come in and do anything and post stickers and do actions as they like. And so this one is, and so all the actions that I just showed, they were the first phase of our organizing, and this is kind of the second phase. And I think it's also most important right now is because, as Andrew mentioned earlier, we've had 5 years of inaction. We haven't gotten a concrete response from Guggenheim. There are no plans of action in place right now. And this is when we're actually crystallizing it to 3 basic demands and asking Guggenheim to kind of, fulfill those before they begin construction. And actually right now is the time when they're also going to get their contractor assigned, and the construction is going to, on the actual building, is going to begin this year. So the 3 demands that we're asking for is a living wage. So most of the workers actually just get paid $250 basic salary, around that much, for the Louvre that is getting constructed right now. And from our research, we know that most of the workers actually demand $500 approximately. The second is debt jubilee, right? So none of the workers should actually go into recruitment debt to be building the museum, which ranges from around $1,500 to $2,000. And the third one is right to organize, which is something which is important because workers have been organizing and they often get reported for any action that they take. So, you know, this is kind of like the second phase that we're working on, and, you know, Venice is also part of that. And in this particular case, the aesthetics that we've used is on Kavara. And that was the kind of solo show that was happening. It just ended yesterday, I think, which was on Kavara. He basically makes these paintings of dates as he goes to different places, and the behind of these paintings are either newspapers or just general images. And so we had May Day translated in different languages, and we did the occupation on May Day and held space for the entire day and shut down the museum, demanding to actually talk to the Board of Trustees. So this is like the most recent phase that we are in. And that's Karl Marx. And then the last thing I would say is, how does media play into this? So, and as Amin mentioned, you know, we have the privilege of being in New York, and Guggenheim, New York being very, you know, being the central kind of outpost to that. We always have media that is embedded in our actions, be it New York Times, be it Hyperallergic, which is kind of like our go-to place within the art world. And to think of our actions as like, you know, these media-based strategies, and also to think of how do we hack their own PR system. You know, they've had to officially hire somebody now who totally manages their PR ever since we started these actions. So that, I mean, I think those are the 4 categories that I would broadly work on. I think that's it. Is there anything else?